Welcome to Harmony Talk, a podcast about dreamers and doers. Hear people from all walks of life tell us about their dreams and the moment they knew there was no turning back as they went from dreaming to doing. This podcast is sponsored by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. My name is Greg Frigoletto, your host for this episode. Today I feel like I'm introducing someone I have known for a lifetime, but in reality, I just recently met. For this episode of Harmony Talk, I am absolutely honored to welcome author and educator Bridey Thelen-Heidel. Quite honestly, when reading her award-winning memoir, Bright Eyes, Surviving Our Monsters and Learning to Live Without Them, I was moved, affected, and inspired in a way that I've almost never experienced. Her style of writing and the story she tells creates a sense of familiarity with the author, the person, that brings you along for the ride, side by side with her from page to page, from incident to incident, from day to day, the entire time marveling at her bravery, optimism, and resilience. Along with being an award-winning author, Bridey also has a day job teaching high school English, where she's been awarded Best of Tahoe Teacher on multiple occasions. You can also check Bridey out on the TED Talk series with her talk entitled Rob the Trauma, Steal Back Your Life. Bridey, welcome to Harmony Talk.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. That was a very generous introduction. Thank you.
I read the book and, in most cases, and you're an English teacher, so I'm sure you're an avid reader, when you're reading fiction and you finish the chapter and you put the book down, if it's a good book, you can't wait to get back to getting into the book to kind of get back to the characters who you start to know. You're starting to have an image of what that person might even look like or what they operate like and what their personality might be like. And, your book, which I absolutely loved, is not a fictional piece. Your book is much deeper than that. This is real. Your book is a memoir, and in it, you are brutally honest. You tell your story of living with an alcoholic mom, a mom who was addicted to dangerous men. You changed school 22 times. You witnessed things that were frightening and dangerous. And you appear to not spare details that I'm sure were absolutely horrific to live through and maybe just as difficult to put on paper. And that's where I'd like to start. When writing your memoir, you clearly decided you were going to put it all out there. Now, I wonder, was that decision personal, maybe for therapeutic reasons, or was it to inspire others who might share a similar story, or maybe both?
Well, I think when you're writing a memoir and you give yourself permission to finally tell the stories, in my case, they came out fast and furious. And there was so much that I had been holding in that once I started writing, I couldn't write fast enough. I actually had to do the Google tool where you can dictate so I could just speak to the paper, or I hand wrote a lot of it and just wrote and wrote and wrote. And I feel like as I wrote, I was telling myself the truth, and it was a truth that I hadn't really ever told myself. I had changed it. I had watered it down. I had certainly tried to forget it. And so I think that's how it came out at first was, here it comes, it's coming fast. And then I think I wrote it for the little girl in the book. And I think she deserved her truth to be told. And I'm sure there are things I didn't tell. And I'm sure because it's my perspective, other people, it's not their truth. But I think I did try to honor her. And I think there's also a sense I was trying to honor other survivors, because we don't tell the truth for so long that when we do, I just felt like I had to go for it. And I felt like once I decided not to protect anybody else, I think that's really important when you're writing a memoir. You have that in the back of your head that you're going to protect certain people or you're going to protect certain situations, or you want to sound better than you actually were. I think that's something too, that's a pitfall in memoir, is that you become this heroic kind of, because in your head, you did everything right. So I just tried to be as honest as I could.
You really did a great job in portraying you, and your honesty seemed to be very apparent to me. And every time I returned to the book, to the next chapter, I kept hoping that every time I would move on in the book, that the story would change in a different direction. Because, you covered really from the very early part of your life to kind of where you are today. And chapter after chapter after chapter, the imagery and the details that were shared were painting a very difficult picture. I kept hoping, that at some point things would change for you. And at some point in the book, they really do. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Or maybe as a segue into that, there were two instances in the book that resonated with me in that they provided like a human element. And my reading it had me believing that these instances gave you hope and inspiration. And maybe you can tell me a little bit about them. But first, let me explain what these two instances were. So the first, you were a young girl when, after winning a statewide essay contest, your mom's friend gave you a PSAT study guide. And I think that's something you carried with you for a long time, and I want to hear more about that in a minute. And the other was many years later when you were substitute teaching, and a secretary in the building you were in that day, after seeing you work with troubled kids all day, said something along the lines to you of, whether you know it or not, teaching is something you have to do. And then I think she went on to say that the kids that you were working with who were difficult kids that day need you, and that you needed them, and that the reason that you were good for them was that your story was similar to their story. And I'm wondering, in your lifetime, do those moments stick out to you as inspirational moments? They must have, because they're in the book. But maybe you can elaborate a little on the human element behind those stories and what they really meant to you.
Yeah, I think growing up in abuse, you are very quick to believe all the negative things that you're told. And I was certainly told a lot of negative things about myself. And I think that one thing that really helped me is that at some point, I just decided to believe the good things too. And when Mac gave me the PSAT book, that was the first time anybody had an expectation of me to do anything bigger than what it felt like I was fated to do, was just to follow my mom's footsteps, right? To be broke, to get pregnant young, to attract very dangerous people into my life. And he told me when he handed me that book that college would change my life. College would give me the life of my dreams. And certainly this was in the early 80s when that was still real. Now, as educators, we know that it can be a little bit tricky anyway, but he had an amazing life. And so I think that him handing me that book, I carried it on all of our moves for years and years and years, along with my Duran Duran records, And I think when Joy at the school, when I was subbing that day, she literally grabbed my face and said, "This is the thing that you have to do." And I talk about in the book how my mom hated teachers. I think because they could turn us in, right, if we got too close to the teachers. But I think I believed Joy in that moment. And the teaching was the last thing I wanted to do. Subbing was just a paycheck. And I do feel like those two moments were extremely pivotal in my life. And there were a few others, right, where I believed the people who told me that I would be good at doing something. And I'm grateful, for sure.
I took it with the PSAT book, which, you did mention, and it's in the book, that you really brought with you everywhere you went. And it almost appeared to me like when you got to the next destination, the new town you'd be living in, one of the many schools you may have attended, wherever you could have placed that book in whatever bedroom you may have been staying in, it needed to be visible, almost in a way that was symbolic, reminding you you're going to be okay and that there is still a spark of a dream. And did it appear on your dresser at each location you went really kind of that way? Because you were too young really to start studying for the PSAT. I always thought reading it that you needed to look at it because it was a reminder of good and hope.
It really was. And it had these terrible pages that were not comfortable. They were just kind of crinkly paper, and it was a huge book. It was like the old phone books that we had. It was massive. So it was pretty cumbersome to move around as much as we did. But yes, I absolutely put it up on my dresser, and I looked at it face out with the acronym on the front. And I would periodically open it, and I would try to do a math problem, or I would try to read a passage, and, nothing made sense in it. I was 12, 13, 14. But I think it was something that I just kept looking at. It was definitely a talisman of some sort. It was a reminder. And certainly, I think holding those things in my thoughts, I went on to college. It worked.
It did work. And I want to actually jump into that and kind of going back a little bit to what, the school secretary, Joy, saw in you when you were substitute teaching. I'm an educator myself, and I've always used this theory that I've kind of concocted, and it's something that I think you can relate to. And the truth is, every one of us and every student, every kid puts their head on the pillow at night and they reflect on their day. And my theory is that all of us, especially in the profession you're in now, have a role that we can play in determining what that reflection might look like. It kind of goes along with the idea that, everyone that walks through the front doors on any given day has something, and that there are no exceptions because everybody's got something. It also kind of lends itself into trauma-informed decision-making. And, that's a practice in the field of education where educators consider the potential impact of trauma on students when they're making decisions about their learning and behavior, hoping to avoid, re-traumatization and trying to create that safe space. So, having gone what you've gone through and kind of fast forwarding a little bit to what you're doing now, you're a teacher, you're an award-winning English teacher in a high school. What do those things that you've been through and some of the things that I've just said, how does that resonate with you? And how does that have you maybe face each day a little different with the students that are sitting in front of you?
Well, I will tell you, as a young teacher, I started at about 28 years old. I wanted to save all the kids. So I definitely wanted to move kids in constantly. I think also I was reticent to call home and call parents to say anything because I knew if a phone call had come home when I was a kid, it wouldn't have been good. Even if it was a good phone call, it would have caused a lot of conflict. I quickly got over that and realized that I wanted to call home and say nice things, and I wanted to see the kids, right? So moving as much as I did, teachers never really got to see me. They never really, I don't even think, learned my name. And by no fault of theirs. I mean, I moved every 6 months or so I wasn't really around much. But I think the way that my life has informed my teaching is I see my kids. I notice their haircut. I notice when they're gone. I make sure they know I missed them when they were gone. I also validate when they're tired, when they have excuses, without enabling or providing a crutch. Also kind of pushing them to become bigger than their own stories, to write their own story. To some extent, I think that's another aspect of it too, is letting them know that the story they've been written into can be changed and maybe should be changed. And so providing that for them and just saying, like, I get it, I see it, it's real, and what are you going to do differently? And I think that has been really the piece for me that I know I'm where I'm supposed to be. Because every time in the last few years, as a teacher, it's been pretty stressful, this environment. And every time I think I need to get out and do something different, I have a kid in my classroom and I realize that's why I didn't leave yet. I'm here for that kid. And I have one right now. And I said that to her the other day. And I think not only seeing them, but also taking those moments, when you see somebody near, think in your head like, wow, that's a great shirt, or what a great smile that person has. And we don't say it, which I wish we would, to strangers or people. I say it to my kids. So I definitely say the things that can kind of change their mood.
Going back to the Joy and the Mac stories that were in the book, in education, people need to hear that. So whether you're a child who needs to be reminded that you're special or that you look really good today, or even an adult every once in a while to hear, you did a great job with that, or really well done, or you really inspired me. It's amazing when those things are said, which, like you just mentioned, aren't said enough, the impact that they have on people. I've been places where, a mom might say, I don't know if you remember, but 4 years ago, you said this to my son. I might not even remember that I said it, but in some way it impacted them. And that goes back to the, putting your head on your pillow at night theory that I try to emphasize all the time. It's that when that student is putting his or her head on the pillow that night, your role could be a positive part of that story, a positive part of that reflection. Because like you said, it's challenging. The world we're living in is challenging. For kids, maybe it's more challenging than it's ever been, and there's no shortage of things that they're going to hear or be exposed to that could bring them down. So why not be that person that tries to build them up?
Yeah, and I think I've been teaching long enough. My first class of students turned 40 years old this year. And along the book tour, a lot of them showed up. And so I've been seeing students I taught when they were 14 years old. and they're coming to my book events and they're buying my book and having conversations with me about the book and remembering, just like you said, saying, remember when I was in your 7th grade class, your 9th grade class? And it's just so powerful because they remember the good things, right? And so again, I think we're so good at remembering the bad things. And unfortunately, especially about teachers, right? I'm very mindful of that if a teacher tells you, oh, you're bad at math, you remember that forever and you can never do math again. So I'm pretty grateful they remember the good things.
If I could, just to go back to the book, I found it absolutely incredible, through the entire book. No matter how bad the day was or how many tears you cried or how egregious something was, you always seemed to remain intact, although at times barely. You remained intact with a level of maturity and understanding of right and wrong. So as you were witnessing things, you didn't absorb it in a way that had you believe that that's the way life needs to be. You recognized things as wrong. And in the world of psychology, there's this thing that they called emotional dysregulation, where oftentimes children who are raised in a household where the parents have an inability to regulate, oftentimes, and sadly, it kind of transfers to the child who kind of learns that behavior. And, as I was reading the book, I marveled at how you had and continue to have this ability to regulate in a way that is kind of not necessarily typical for somebody that's been what you've been through. So I would wonder how you would describe being able to break that cycle and avoid that result.
I think a couple things myself, because I have sisters, we have different fathers. I have a biological father who I can only imagine I inherited his sense of optimism, and I inherited a lot of his mannerisms and his character. And he passed away recently, but just a fantastic human with so much optimism. And I wonder if just by the luck of the draw, I happened to inherit that. And so I was given some things, some strengths that maybe my sisters weren't, unfortunately. I think as a young kid, I also recognized, for whatever reason, probably because I had dangerous people coming in my house. And I think this is actually pretty common for kids growing up in trauma and abusive environments. We segregate very quickly when somebody walks through the door. Dangerous, not dangerous, safe, not safe. And I think that sense of regulation, as you call it, if somebody was safe, I was one person. If somebody was not safe, I was a different kid, right? And I always knew that if I did everything opposite for my mom, I would be okay. And so from a very young age, whatever she did, even though I loved her desperately before I realized I didn't like her, I did the opposite from her. And I watched her choices, and I watched her drinking, and I watched her drugs, and I watched the men she chose and people she fell in love with. And for good or bad, as a kid, that's hard. And so you see in the book the effects of it. I mean, I have an eating disorder. I've got dissociative disorder. I'm flying out of my head, literally, I mean, I was kind of a train wreck, but I also was very grounded, ironically. And so I think that helped.
You mentioned that love for your mom, which is clear, right? And also you mentioned that maybe some of the resilience that you have, that quality to be resilient, might have come from your actual biological dad. And in the book, I hope I'm saying this correctly, I think there was a period where you were kind of reintroduced to him and you moved in with him, and his life provided, in quotes, normalcy. You caught him at a time in his life where whatever demons he might have faced were behind him. And, it was a very normal experience, which I read to be shocking for you. I wonder, the normalcy which you seem to have some appreciation for, but a hard time adjusting to, on top of the love for your mom, had you returned to your mom when you could have stayed with your dad. And have you ever thought about that? I'm sure you have. Have you thought about that decision you made? Because ultimately it was your decision, that return to mom, how things could have been different? Or are you sitting here today saying the story's the story, and if you changed anything, you wouldn't be sitting here today? Like, how does that decision appear now that you made then?
I definitely was addicted to my mom. I was addicted to our relationship, codependent on a very dangerous level. I'm sure I was 14 and thought that I was the sun and the moon and all to her. And she was to me. So yeah, normal, even though I wanted it, I didn't recognize it. It wasn't comfortable. It felt kind of like, a scratchy sweater. But going back to her was not just her, it was also my baby sister, who at the time was a toddler, 2 or 3 years old, and in a pretty dangerous situation. And she actually is now 41, my sister Bevins, and she didn't know that reason that I went back until she read the book. So that's been a pretty powerful kind of awareness and understanding that I could have had a very different life, but then what would her life have been like? And she's a fantastic person and she's a great mom. And I think as a kid, I didn't think about myself. I just thought about saving her. And I was almost at the point where I realized I couldn't really help my mom anymore, but I could help that little girl. So yeah, of course, you think about like how your choices affect everything. And it did go on when I made that choice to leave my dad. It was probably one of the hardest years of my whole childhood, for sure. Terrifying and dangerous. But I have the relationship with my sister now, and she's still around. And I don't know. It was very dangerous when she was in that house.
And it seemed like you were put in the position. As a matter of fact, I think at one point your mom said during a pregnancy, you're going to be the dad. You were put in that parent role. Sometimes I think it appeared to be with purpose and sometimes by default, but either way, you embraced it. So your answer to why you went back could not be any more perfect because you stepped up there. And, you mentioned your mom and the relationship with her in an analogous way being like a scratchy sweater. But if I have a sweater that's really scratchy, I don't wear it and maybe I throw it away. Right? Yeah. But in your world, the later part, you kind of threw that scratchy sweater away because you knew it wasn't good for you. And could you talk a little bit about that? Because in the book, you refer to the monsters, surviving monsters. And at some point, along with some bad choices with guys who were monsters in your life and your mom's life, she started to maybe categorically be one of those monsters. And can you tell me about that? And at what point and how did you come to the understanding and realization that you need to step away?
Yeah, it was really heartbreaking watching her decline, to put it mildly, because it had been she and I against these men for so many years. And then all of a sudden, because she couldn't battle them herself, she battled me. And so I became her enemy and I became her punching bag. And I think, as much as I love my mom, it was no longer something that I could sustain. It was killing me. It was killing me on emotionally, spiritually, physically, when she was just awful and super abusive. But of course, as we do, I stayed and tried and tried and tried well into my 20s. And at one point, she called threatening to kill my sisters and kill herself. That was very much a breaking point where I realized that she not only couldn't be saved, she didn't want to be saved. And I think that was something I was in my early 20s that was very freeing to realize that it wasn't about me saving her anymore, because that was impossible. And so could I save my sisters? I don't know. Could I save myself? Absolutely. So I think we get into this cycle of that savior thing where we don't leave because of the others. And I did have to leave my little sisters behind at one point, and their lives were very changed because of it. And there was a lot of guilt around that. But they also were growing into their own people and can make their own decisions as well. So when I finally did let go of my mom, it was because I had a daughter of my own and she was 1, and I was watching this cycle repeat. And of course, I wish I had done it for myself, but I finally did do it for my daughter. And she's never met my mom. She hasn't seen her since she was 1, and I haven't spoken to my mom in 22 years and don't regret a minute of it. So that's something we have to allow survivors to do too, is leave.
Yeah, and that's not being selfish. That's about self-preservation and being a mom and trying to avoid that cycle. And, those are some very heavy, deep things. And to lighten it up maybe just a little, if we could, Bridey, like you, I'm a big music person. I love music. And, we all know, and I think you probably would agree that, our senses, our sense of smell, sound, they really trigger memory in a way that is very profound. And, as a music person, I could remember very early in my life, attaching myself to certain bands and albums that to this day, when I hear them, like I am brought right back. And I know for you, there was an affection for Duran Duran, especially the lead singer, Simon. And, along with your PSAT book, you carried those records and posters with you. They also were symbolic. And it's a little bit more than fandom, maybe. I love bands and, I go to see the concerts and then you put it away. It seems like this is a little bit different for you. And I wondered, there's two parts to what I'd like to ask you. One is, how important was it to you, the music? How did it impact you? And because I know later, you were on stage with Duran Duran at one point and that was a big deal. But did Simon, the lead singer, ever know and learn your story? So two pieces. What did Duran Duran really mean to you? On what level? How deep did they impact you? And why? And did Simon ever learn your story?
Well, he has my book. So he just got it about a month and a half ago. In fact, all the members of Duran Duran got my book. So that's exciting. I'm waiting for the phone call. I think at the time, I was 12 when I discovered their music. And I don't know, like any kid, I was just completely glued to these very attractive young guys singing on stage. And it became absolutely more than fandom. But, years later, I went back and I did some research about why I connected so much with this band. And I found out, which is very true for me, and I'm sure a lot of people, that when you connect with celebrity, you connect with a musician or a band at a time when you're going through something very traumatic, there is a trauma bonding that happens for a lot of reasons. And in my case, their music gave me emotional escape and emotional intelligence. So at 12 years old, I was not really allowed to have an emotion that was not my mom's. So if she was happy, I got to be happy. If she was mad, I could be mad. Other than that, my emotions were not my own. But with the music, they were my own. So I could listen to their music and I could be joyful and I could be angst and I could be all these things that were wrapped up in Simon Le Bon's lyrics. And that gave me a freedom. And it gave me an understanding of my own emotions. And I could pour through, remember the liner notes that we used to have in albums, and you could read and try to dissect all the lyrics. And it was also joyful. I think too, I got to be my age when I listened to their music, and I never got to be my age. I never got to be a kid. But when you put on their songs or listen to MTV, I got to dance around and be goofy and silly. And I think that's an experience that I was just longing for, was to just be a normal kid in middle school, being ridiculous. I have since connected with people through their music, and there are other Duranis, as we call ourselves, who also discovered them at a tough time. But yeah, there's some interesting science behind why we connect with bands like that.
Yeah, and for you and for a lot of people, bands and music could be, like the great escape. And I think you and I are around the same age. And for anybody that's listening that didn't grow up, let's say in the 80s, they don't realize the impact, that MTV had on us when those videos were coming on. It seemed at the time otherworldly, and it was something so new, and you were so drawn in that I'm sure that added to your wonderment. A lot of times with music, when you are emotionally attached like you were, this was probably 83, 84, somewhere around then. As bands go on, and Duran Duran they've made a lot of albums since those days. Do you find that you are more emotionally attached to those albums from those times versus their newer music, which is also amazing? But do you find yourself more emotionally attached for maybe nostalgic reasons and for interpersonal reasons to those early albums?
Oh, for sure. I mean, all of us, you hear a song and it takes you back to the moment, usually the first time you heard it. And there's so many songs that, yeah, they take me back to those times. And some of them I listened to while I was writing the book, just to put me back in that space and in that place. And some of them are very hard. But now I'm good. I don't get triggered by the music anymore. I don't get triggered by those things. So now it's fun. It's fun. And I still feel young. And when I got to meet him, which was so exciting, I was definitely a 13-year-old. There he was standing right there. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, that is amazing. And there's a lot of gratitude I'm sure you have for him and for the band, because they really did get you through tough times. And I think that's really special.
Yeah, it's very special. And I feel like, I hope, because I know they were very confused about how I got the meeting with them and then taking me on stage. And there were so many components to all of it that I think our heads were all spinning. But I hope they read the book. I really do. So they can see not just my story, but the stories of so many of their fans and what they helped us go through. All musicians, really. But in particular, I hope they realize that my story is very similar to a lot of people who grew up with their music, and we're incredibly grateful for what it did for us, for sure.
Oftentimes, artists lyrically will inspire people in a way that truly resonates with you and resonates with me. And you'll read stories about musicians who will have people often tell them that they changed their lives. And there's a real power there. And I think that's part of what must be the joy of being an artist, to know that you could have that impact, much like for you being an author and a teacher. Before we start to wrap it up, and I could talk all day about music and your book, but we really do have somewhat of a time limit here. This is, as I said in the beginning, a podcast about dreamers and doers. And, your story is super interesting in that for a long period of your life growing up, the dreaming part could have been extinguished. My question is, did you continue to dream beyond the four walls that you were living in as you were growing up? Or was there a point later where the realization that your dreams can come true occurred to you? Did you lose hope and lose the ability to dream during those tough years?
I think there are moments, certainly, when you question why things are happening to you. And I'm sure we've all had it, when you think something is going to work out one way and it doesn't, and you feel blindsided by circumstances or the universe or whatever it is. I certainly had times when I was on the ground and couldn't really figure out how to pick myself up. But I also, again, I think it was just burning in my belly, that there was something bigger. And I also think maybe this is something people can relate to. I just kept thinking, there's no way I'm going through all of this for no reason. Why am I being put to all these tests? There's some reason. And I do feel like it's because I was supposed to be a teacher and use a lot of those tests. And I was supposed to be a great mom and a great wife. And I think that dreaming big, we talk about it almost every day in my classroom. Like, why not? Why not just go for it? Why not believe? Because you're going to believe something. So choose what you're going to believe. And I choose to believe that all things are possible. And if things don't go right, like meeting Duran Duran, I was on the Ellen show a couple years before that, didn't get to meet him then, and the world didn't explode and nothing happened. I just kept going. And I told my students that. They were so bummed for me. And I just said, we'll just keep going. And I really believe now, like, the success of this book has blown me away. So I hope that people don't give up on their dreams. I really do. And when they don't work out when you think they're supposed to, I think it's because they're supposed to work out even better in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's words of wisdom. And without getting too far into it, I know you speak a little bit in your TED Talk about, similar themes, the ROB part of the acronym. And if you could just very briefly tell us what the ROB acronym means, and hopefully that'll have people tune into your podcast.
ROB is resilience, optimism, and bravery. And those were qualities that I realized surviving these monsters I had developed, and figured out they were almost superpowers anymore these days, right? Resilience is hard to come by for a lot of people. But if you have survived, period, you've got it.
Well, Bridey, I can't thank you enough for sharing your story with us. I applaud you for daring to tell your story with honesty. You inspire everyone that faces adversity and challenges to recognize that their dreams can become a reality if you remain, as you put it, resilient, optimistic, and brave. On behalf of all of us at Harmony Talk, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this. And thanks for being a fantastic educator.
Thank you. Folks, if you're interested in hearing more, I've been talking with Bridey Thelen-Heidel, author, teacher, and motivational speaker. Please check out her book, Bright Eyes, Surviving Our Monsters and Learning to Live Without Them, as well as her TED Talk entitled Rob the Trauma, Steal Back Your Life. You can also follow Bridey on her socials at Bright Eyes Author, as well as BrideyThelen-Heidel.com. This has been Harmony Talk by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm Greg Frigoletto. Thank you to Bridey for being with us today. To our listeners, continue to dream and keep doing.